Hello, everyone. First of all, we would like to thank Mr. Dr. Alonso for this webinar. First of all, we are so excited to have you, Dr. Alonso. To start, can you tell us why AI has become essential for anyone working in finance today?
Yeah, so thanks again, BFC, for inviting us. We're very glad to start this collaboration. And so, I mean, not a lot of people knows that I started my career actually at KPMG a bunch of years ago, right? Doing audit, right, for 3 years, right? So I started my career doing audit for finance companies, right, back in the 90s, right? And back then it was all, obviously accounting, and it was all we were using Apple, some sort of, the laptops, but the first ones, right? And we were using the first spreadsheets, right, to some sort of, do accounting and audit in the large financial institutions. So, and we actually founded the Artificial Intelligence Finance Institute in 2018, so almost 8 years ago. And we had back then, already the intuition and the idea that artificial intelligence would be something that would be very, very important in finance, right? And back then in 2018, it was kind of a bit of natural language processing, but just we were starting, right? We're doing X-ray keeping, not something that you could use for audit or finance or accounting back then. But certainly in 2022, November 2022, when ChatGTP kind of, started being available commercially, we were also back then had, kind of the vindication. Oh yes, these machines are pretty close to humans back then, but still, they're not able to maybe read well spreadsheets or PDFs or words and so on. And a lot of people said back then in 2022, oh, this is not going to go anywhere because, these machines are dumb. And we're now in April 2026 with, I think almost everybody has come to the conclusion that large language models and artificial intelligence are extremely useful, right? Everywhere to do obviously accounting, audit, in finance, incredibly useful. There's a lot of numbers, but there's a lot of text. There's a lot of decisions that need to be taken, and so on. And I think now in April 2026, there's literally, I don't think there's anybody that has kind of not an agenda, a hidden agenda, or a clear agenda that some sort of says you don't need to learn about how to use them and they're not useful, right? On the contrary, right? LMMs are incredibly useful, right? GPT, Opus, Anthropic 4.7, Gemini, DeepSeek, uh, so on, right, are kind of incredibly. So we had the idea of preparing a course, right? Or BFC had the idea of preparing for you a course, right, that helps some sort of financial professionals to learn, but learn deeply, right? So the idea is that you kind of go home with some sort of a deep understanding of how LMM technologies, AI technologies can be used in finance, right? Let me give a bit of a background of who we are, right? So as I said, we founded in New York in 2018. AIFI is an independent research and institute. We work on the intersections of AI, mathematics, and finance. You can find you can find all our papers in SSRN, almost 200, and we will have soon 5 books out there, right? Two of about uh, artificial intelligence in finance that are have kind of more of a quant finance color, right? The third also, it's called quantitative portfolio optimization, but the two coming are one about large language models and one other about OpenAI, right? And we're finishing more books, right? I'm finishing a book on LMMs in finance and so on. So we believed in the technology. The technology has gone some sort of the direction, but if you want to do a good job, if we want to keep your job, so to speak, right? There's a lot of precautions and there's a lot of attention to detail that you need to take, right? Our partner in this is BFC, who's, if my informations are right, based in Beirut with offices in Hamra and Headache. And the idea is to bring this program to auditors, accountants, professionals, financial managers across the Middle East region, right? Myself, I'm the founder of the institute, right? I have an embarrassingly long experience in finance. I started my career in 1994, right? Again, when we were kind of using the first spreadsheets available, right? You can't imagine in 1994, we were using Lotus 123, right? That maybe some of the veterans still remember. Before Excel, it was something called Lotus 123, which was the first kind of useful, and it was very useful for financial professionals. For the first time, we could have some sort of panel in which we can submit our numbers and balance sheets and so on, see if they're uh, and so on and so forth. And I remember that in 1994, the university I'm teaching, one of the universities I'm teaching, we which was my alma mater, right? We had one computer frame who was taking 3 hours to do a full variable regression, linear regression, which is now you can do obviously with all the LMMs, but you can do also with Excel. You can do it in a second, so to speak. So technology has certainly changed a lot during these years. So I work at KPMG again, right? I was the youngest supervising senior in Spain, right? I think I was 25 years of age, right? I was already supervising senior, and then I decided that I wanted to do finance, and I moved to a bank, right? Um, a bank called Anbank, and then in UBS, and then I got my PhD 2010, right? So not a long time ago, but not a long time ago. So I was already 40, right? And yeah, the idea was, and the idea, I started becoming more and more convinced that mathematics, right, and AI would become something even more important, right? And again, and this is what has happened, right? So and obviously, I think that importantly, people was first thinking that LMMs were English language, right? And certainly there's very strong in English language, but today I was reading that more and more users are using LMMs in their own languages. You see what I mean? So you're moving on from English prompts to Arabic prompts or Chinese prompts or French prompts or you see what I mean? So people is getting more and more confident also in the abilities of large language models to understand my native language, right? In which probably I feel more comfortable writing and so on and so forth. And obviously OCR, which is at the heart of the technologies of the optical character recognition, right, is getting better in all languages. Still, there are issues, right? So this is what we also learn in the course. There are issues in OCR, right? So technology is not perfect. Technology sometimes doesn't read correctly. Um, Sometimes technology doesn't pick correctly a balance sheet, especially if it's a very large spreadsheet and so on, or even a PDF, right? So technology is almost mature, but there's still gaps, right, in the that we need to be very aware of, right? If we don't want to send the wrong financial statements to the CFO or to a CEO, we need to take a kind of a lot of precautions. So the AI taxonomy, the course will be kind of practical, but again, these 12 hours will not be some sort of a bit of prompting here and there, but it would be a deeper dive into technology, right? There's a lot of things that for financial professionals need to, or can be doing, right, using AIs. Uh, but current abilities of LMMs in terms of financial management, I'm sure you've tried, right? I'm sure you've shown your balance sheet to the machine, and I'm sure you're impressed about the kind of knowledge and right. I have to be obviously careful always about one of the caveats of understanding well technology is trying to understand where AIs have a superficial knowledge, which happens, right? Which happens that, and then we probably need to retrieve augmented generation. You see what I mean? For the fact that the machine seems to use technical words, right? That probably doesn't mean that knows our accounting rules of your country, right? Or I don't know, context about your company, and so on and so forth. You see, so there's a lot of work that needs to be put into some sort of the correct use of I always say LMMs are a bit like humans, right? Because of computing, LMMs are lazy because they don't want to spend a lot of time computing. So they might give us a superficial answer on a very important question for us. You see what I mean? Maybe want to do again a full audit, but I don't know. Claude is just spending a bit, just spend just a bit of time, right? And our job as financial professionals is to some sort of as we try to do with our colleagues and other accountants or other audit professionals is that they need to work and think deeply about the problems. You see, you can't be lazy. You can't say, oh, there's something a bit bizarre in the balance sheet. So there's some movements that we don't understand well, but let's go ahead, right? And send the financial statements. You see what I mean? We're our some LMs are lazy and do mistakes, right? So OCR mistakes or and so on. Okay, so what the course, a bit the logistics of the course is from the if there's some mistakes, just let me know. Right, from 12 to the 22nd May, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Fridays, 6:30 to 8:30 Beirut time. 6 live sessions in which I'll be, the main instructor. You can ask questions, obviously live or after, right? And no AI or programming required, so to speak, right? This also comes with a bit of a caveat in the sense that, again, if you want to work well with the machines, it's like Excel, right? If you're not going to do good work with Excel, superficial knowledge is not enough, right? Yeah. Sorry.
Okay, Dr. Miguel, continue, please.
Sure. So superficial knowledge is not, again, enough, right? And this is one of the same thing with agents. These days a lot of people is talking about agent. I was in Boston 2 weeks ago talking about agents in finance and agents people think that agents will save our lives and do all our work and so on. It turns out that, as I said it at the beginning, I think the most I think the best definition of a current state of LMMs is they're incredibly, intelligent, so to speak. They can show an impressive superficial knowledge. It's our responsibility to understand to what extent, the LMM has been using the right data set, the right context to be telling us something, right? And that we've investigated the sources of and put guardrails in the sources of error, right? LMMs are hallucinating less and less, but still, LMMs can some sort of, you know, get a PDF, and because of changing the format of the PDF, maybe, just as an example, right? We as I said, we're working in the edition of different books, and for example, Gemini and DeepSeek yesterday were accused by Claude, right, of sending bullshit because I was showing something to Google, to Gemini. I was showing something to DeepSeek. They were coming with false criticism based on a faulty OCR, faulty optical character recognition. When PDFs are small, numbers are small, tables are populated, right? Again, the chances that there are errors in the OCR that then would lead potentially to errors in our work, right, is something we need to be paying a lot of attention, right? Again, when PDFs are funky, problems are around the corner, right? Or when we have a very heavily populated spreadsheets with a lot of sheets and so on, we need to kind of, okay. So we're here because there are these three forces, right, that are converging. One is these, again, right, foundational models like Claude, GPT, Gemini, DeepSeek, and so on, right? Have convinced almost all users that you can show and discuss and some sort of trust, but trust is a word in capital letters, right? You shouldn't trust, right? You shouldn't. You're auditors, right? So some of you are auditors. So the same thing that you maybe you need to always be skeptical about the numbers you've been shown, about the proofs you've been shown, about a financial statement and so on. A similar approach you should have with the AIs, in the sense that the AIs can some sort of do mistakes, or as everybody knows, right? So everybody has been talking about for 3 years about prompting, and still you see that professionals are making mistakes, like using very fluffy prompts with the machines, like do your best, like, or like you agents debate about what we're going to say about these financial statements and so on, right? Okay, needless to say, right? So fluffy baked prompts also are an enemy to us, right? Because machines might kind of understand differently than we do things about. So there's the regulation. Regulation are regulators are obviously worried, and they should be, right? Worried about the in Boston. I said that one of the main threats about the use of the technology, again, is the some sort of the some so the hype is so high that some people tends to think that again, AIs know about everything and they can solve anything. right? And no, right? Even if you hire, right, as a PhD in finance to do your accounting, we know that again, also very smart humans do mistakes, right? They forget things, they read incorrectly an email, right, that they have been sent, or they type incorrectly an amount, right, and all of a sudden instead of 1 million it's 100,000. So there's a bunch of, right, and one of the most stressful uh, activities that I've done, it was when I was very young. It was like, in KPMG, we're helping the companies, the banks, to perform to write the annual report with the technology of 1995, 96, which were, right, some sort of laptops and word processors and very rudimentary spreadsheets and so on, but not a lot of edition. It was all manual. We had to check a million times things, right, and so on, right. This kind of skepticality, so to speak, that so this is the right approach when you use AIs, right? So you even if you're kind of writing something that doesn't seem like, even an email can get you into trouble, right? If the machine doesn't understand correctly the context, right? If the machine doesn't understand correctly the context, maybe the machine thinks that your boss is your nephew, right? Or and so on, right? So you need to. Okay, data, right? So data, again, we're more and more confident in the. I unfortunately I don't speak Arabic, but and you'll kind of, but I'm pretty sure that the linguistic abilities of LMMs in Arabic are pretty strong already, right? Probably they weren't at the beginning. Probably, beginning when I when I remember when ChatGPT went, in November 2022. For example, my Chinese students were saying, right, the Chinese of GPT is kind of a bit weird when it writes, and now my Chinese students say that it's perfectly fine, right? Guess that same thing for Arabic, right? And so you can use it to translate things pretty safely. But anyway, so what do we need to understand, right? So this is a long list. So obviously we will not some sort of big deep diving, right, on these technologies. Obviously you can buy our books on large language models, right? If you want to some sort of have a really deep understanding uh, of the technology. Again, the course is more for, right, a reasonable understanding, and especially about the different drawbacks the technology has, right? But artificial intelligence is not only elements, by the way. It's not only, right. Obviously, now we're used to some sort of spend a lot of time, but also for accounting and also for the finance function, you know, it's good to know data science, so to speak, because sometimes you just want to do a different analytical work, right? So not only large language models, right? Mm. We're writing a paper as we speak about you know large language models are general machines, right? Are not decision machines, right? So to speak. Maybe I ask a question, and maybe the machine again doesn't really have the same kind of understanding or the same reward function that you have, right? When you ask a question about inventory or about, if you can explain um, technically what happened in the balance sheet, what were the movements, and what are they telling us about the different assets and liabilities and so on. So we need to be careful again about the precision that we need when we're performing a financial tasks or and some sort of the superficial knowledge that or maybe not superficial but not enough, not deep enough knowledge and so on. Anyway, so that's why we kind of in college, in universities, we're kind of shifting a bit, right? I'm sure that in a few years we will not be teaching the same way supervised and supervised and reinforcement learning, especially reinforcement learning, because there are lots of some sort of new models, right? New models that will help decision making, right, in a more precise manner than LMMs. So we will also see that in the course, right? There's sometimes we need a more specialized model than what Claude is giving us. This is being redefined because again, models are getting so good that what was impossible for them, a year ago, right? So a year ago, Claude was an excellent coder. Now Claude is an almost perfect coder. 5.4, which was a year ago 5.2 or something like that, it was much worse than it is currently. 5.4 or Gemini 2, right, wasn't right, and so on, right? Obviously, there's something that it's always important, but some people tends to think that it's too. But the quality of data is very important, right? Garbage in, garbage out, and so on and so forth. So everybody, I'm sure in the audience have heard about that. The dark truth is that the dark truth is oftentimes is that data is always bad, statistically speaking. So we need to do a lot of clever work to some sort of make our models better, right? So um, again, in college, we had for some years a bit of too much emphasis on algorithms, right? And then too much emphasis on data need to be clean. And then we come to the conclusion that oftentimes data cannot be clean because of one thing that's important, which is reality is messy. Reality is not a clean sheet of a clean data set that allow me to take conclusions without uncertainty and so on, right? So we also need as a financial professionals understand the different trade-offs that we will have in the use of AIs, right? So AIs also will struggle into, right? So imagine that our job is to produce a revenues forecast for next quarter, right? I'm sure you've used LMMs to ask them, right? So also LMMs can help you now to some sort of extrapolate, use a data set and say next step can be this or that and that, right? We will also need to will get a much deeper intuition about all these issues in our course, right? So why kind of have a bit of AI readiness, right? Or kind of, right? It's very important that we kind of understand, kind of, what's inside the AI, so to speak. What's inside supervised learning? What's inside unsupervised? What are the caveats and so on, right? Um, Also, the challenges of doing that in bilingual environments, right? Bilingual environments, or using your native language. I know I'm Spanish, so I sometimes in Catalan sometimes speak in Catalan, and I'm always scared about the machine not translating well, right? Because of maybe not, and so on, right? You can't check everything, right, in an LMM. So maybe a word, a translation of a word in Arabic is not maybe perfect than in English, and that causes trouble, right? And that causes prompting failing or prompting not being right. So this is also an interesting, especially in corporate settings, to what extent you're going to talk in English to the machine, you're going to talk in Arabic, you're going to talk in Spanish, or and so on, right? Yeah. So AI in audit, right? So what can we do with AI? So we have much more analytical power, so to speak, than we had back then, right? When we had, so to speak, only Excel spreadsheets, right? So obviously, Excel spreadsheets helped us big time, right? In the sense that accounting before spreadsheet is something that cannot even, I think, being comprehended these days. But and I did that, right? I remember in a little bit of an anecdote was that I had the military service in Spain, and we didn't have spreadsheets, so we had notebooks, counting notebooks, right? And we had to do, all the operations, arithmetics, and so on by hand. These days, again, you can't even understand what that means, right? But it was very, obviously time consuming. We were doing plenty of mistakes and so on. Then spreadsheets came, and now that we have Python, that we have AIs, it's like we can some sort of, instead of doing sampling, moving to full population testing, for example. You can read all the documents, right? If you have enough compute and some sort of, right, analyze contract by contract, right? If these contracts are well, accounted in the financial statements, right? If these are the contracts we sign, this is the accounting. We can read everything and say, yes, this is the number of new mortgages is correct, right? Or no, there's something bizarre. In the past, our clients could cheat because of with sampling, sometimes it was difficult, right, to some sort of figure out mistakes or cheating, right? So, or cheating in the anomaly detection, right? Uh, NLP, right, and continuous auditing. So again, you can some sort of say, if I have access to all the systems of the company, I can fully audit them, right, in order to try to find duplicate payments or related party irregularities, fixtures, vendors, unusual cross-border patterns, and so on and so forth. On the other side, right, so the let's say that the thieves, the cheaters, also have this technology. So having the technology, right, doesn't ensure, right, that the cheaters are not gonna cheat, right. The cheaters will also be trying to find ways in which they can lie to you, right. So you see what I mean. So AI also brings, right, as we know, right, again, the fact that not only the policemen are smarter, but the bad guys might also be smarter with AI, and that means that we should be always paying attention to new sources of cheating, or new sources of hacking data sets, new sources of, right. Anyway, so, right, for example, right, anomaly detection now can be very, very sophisticated, right, using rule-based thresholds or isolation forests, autoencoders, right. So now I think the auditors will be speaking in a kind of a different language, right, in the sense that they'll be probably having access to all the data set, and can perform tests in the data sets and so on. So that's why they need to kind of understand how the different algorithms characterize the different problems and so on. So again, I'm sure the audit guys these days use a very different language than the one we used right back then, back in the 2000s, right, and so on. So we'll investigate this idea of what happens with Arabic OCR, right? In the sense that optical character recognition is. I was talking to a bank, a U.S. bank, it was like 2 weeks ago, and for example, they use OCR, to kind of read the banking checks. In the United States, there's still a lot of payments are the Americans still use checks, which is a kind of bizarre thing for Europeans, and so on and so forth, right? And the bank had to write and build some sort of a taxonomy of OCR problems, right? Because the machine was failing in different ways when reading checks. Obviously, sometimes because the human writing is kind of very creative, and some human writing, was confusing the machine. So instead of James Smith, it seems that it was Jack Smith or Smooth. You see what I mean? So or table or the way numbers were written on the check, or the signature. So there are plenty of potential, right, problems with signatures, right, with handwritten digits, and so on. So again, this is something that and the bank said no, the agents aren't the problem. The problem is that OCR is pretty faulty. You see what I mean? OCR is not giving us enough precision when it comes to reading banking checks, right? And I said at the beginning, right, that PDFs are big issue, right? People is very creative, but when you have a picture in a PDF in your annual report, that can confuse the elements, right? Or a different way to show a graph, and so on, can confuse the machine, and so on and so forth, right? Over the years, we've seen all sorts of mistakes doing NLP, like for example, the machine thinking that the year is the revenue. So 2025 was kind of, you see what I mean? All the number pages were something of a meaningful number. And it was not. That's the page number. It doesn't mean anything, or not much. But accounting wise, it means nothing, right? And see what I mean, right? So in accounting, right? So there's all topics that we'll be covering is accounts payable and receivable, multi-currency invoice matching, all these things, right? How can we use intelligent automation, RPAs, or agents, right? We spend time talking about agents, right? Agents are needed because humans perform a lots of unstructured tasks, right? Okay, in a finance department, you have a lot of people doing, different structured tasks, like reading things and then translating due to accounting, uh, right, or checking, invoices, or trying to figure out if this is something that we gonna repay to our employees, and so on and so forth. So intelligent invoice processing, right, is something obviously very useful and very hard, right? So this idea of getting the tickets, and from the ticket to accounting, say, oh, the AI is going to do everything. Yeah. So here we need a lot of, right, a lot of OCR in Arabic, in English, right, a lot of LMM parsing and classification, which can be faulty, right? this three-way matching, BIT compliance checks, right? Exception routing, and this idea of human in the loop, right? That it's another trap, right? Why I say it's a trap? Because the ones who've been in business for decades, we know that humans are very faulty too. Your humans kind of approve things or say, we need to do four eyes on this. So somebody checks and puts a stamp. That somebody else has to check and put a stamp. If the two put a stamp, we can go ahead, right? Needless to say, humans might be putting stamps without even looking at, right, the thing, saying, "Oh, I'm sure it's fine." Oh, the guy works well. I'm going to trust him, right? So humans are lazy, and the human in the loop might not be what people thinks it is, right? If the human thinks that AIs never do mistakes, the humans will tend to always approve what comes from the machine without even maybe looking at, right? So this is again, you know, but the young folks say, but again, the ones who've been in business, we know that mistakes are always around the corner because of, again, humans do lots of mistakes, or there might be even new mistakes created because of changes in format of things, right? Or cheating, or hacking systems, and so on, right? So the AI's humans, or so every time you build an agentic system, part of the agents will be there just to kind of double check, be policemen, or policewoman, and so on and so forth, right? There's a lot of also forecasting in financial management, predicting analytics. We need to budget, we need to forecast, we need to go the cash flow and so on. So we need to use predictive analytics. Now we have a really very impressive uh, array of tools that we can use for prediction, right? Also for scenario analysis, right? Credit score, using machine learning for credit scoring and all this kind of stuff, right? Again, right here we will show you, right, a mature way to use the models, right? Not just maybe a bit of a naive and a bit of a naive thought that AIs, right, will do, I don't know, will be 100% right in our budgeting or in our forecasting, right? I'm sure some of you might try it, and what is hard, right? I don't know, if you run a hotel and there's a kind of an uncertainty over, right, especially in this world in which, unfortunately, there's a lot of geopolitical, you know problems and conflicts and so on, right? So forecasting and scenario analysis, for example, for modeling companies, it's kind of necessary and tough at the same time, because macroeconomic variables are subject to kind of also a lot of uncertainty and so on. So, for example, when we forecast cash flows, there's several ways now that we have, right? We can use, some sort of the usual econometric models like ARIMA, autoregressive integrated moving average models that we were teaching, right, at Columbia or NYU and so on, right? Profit, which was some sort of, right, I think was Amazon. Now it's less used and so on. Gradient boosting. So um, you have potential, right? Some sort of but it's very important that we understand, right? That we understand the difficulty of the problems that we're trying to solve. Okay, so again, this is something that we'll spend a lot of time working on. The governance, ethics, and regulation, right? So it cannot be stressed enough the importance as also in any some sort of important human activity. Governance is key in the sense that if you want things to work well, we need we need the we need the we need the players in the game, some sort of, using ethics and paying attention and obviously complying with the regulation and so on. The same thing for AIs when we use them, right, for finance. Right? So we need our agents that if we have an agentic system to some sort of prepare the financial statements and so on, we need also, again, and this is not only words, right? Here, your job is at stake, right? If one of your agents, right, does something illegal, right, you might say, why would it do something illegal? Because maybe your agent thinks, so to speak, that it's going to comply better with your prompt by cheating, right? Then you say, then everybody's saying, okay, so I'm telling the agents to not cheat, right? But this is like agents are a bit like, again, also humans, right? They might have a different idea when you say not do not do that. You see what I mean? They might say, I decided to do otherwise because it was better for you, because revenues were higher if we use this accounting rule instead of another, right? And then you say, don't you think this is not really a conservative way to account for this contract, and so on and so forth, right? So any model touching credit fraud or documentation needs, oversight and regulatory requirements and so on, right? Again, for the fact that machines are machines, we cannot just say, oh, they're not going to be bad actors. They're not going to decide against me. They might. You see what I mean? Again, they might decide that cheating is the best option to some sort of meet your prompt, right? It's like, think about for a second, right? Think for a second. You ask, I don't know, 5.4, right? Produce me a very nice novel, right? Maybe, and maybe, 5.4, some sort of produces something very close to Harry Potter. You see what I mean? So what then humans would say, well, that's fine, but you almost plagiarized, a very successful, fiction. You see what I mean, right? And then you're probably going to need to say, I don't want you to be too close to other successful, because this is kind of closely dangerous to plagiarism, right? You see what I mean? Because you haven't maybe precise enough, right? That anything close to plagiarism, you're not going to be pleased, right? You can't be in trouble, right? Or even plagiarize out of the box, right? Inadvertently and so on. You see what I mean? So all these are your responsibilities, right? If somehow the machine, for example, is plagiarizing something or is copying a marketing campaign from some other competitor, and you haven't realized that the machine kind of inspired too much, and so on and so forth. There's plenty of so basically all complicated tasks for humans, and also landmines in the sense that might bring liabilities, because machines again might not have again the same right or right. It's funny because an interesting thing is I write a lot of things, right, and all of them have a different personality in regards to novelty. You see what I mean? So all the best commercially available elements somehow have a slightly different opinion on what's novelty or what's a new thing. One of these judgment things can get you into trouble in the sense that, oh, you're very close to our model. For example, we have this patented, you just change the name, but it's inherently something you have, it's too inspired on our model. You see what I mean? So the nuances and the different, some sort of interpretations that AIs do can, again, it's like, you have a person in your department that also has kind of a different view on what's legal, not legal, it's a gray zone, and so on and so forth. All these, gray zone things is something you need to work very hard, right? Same thing for fairness, transparency, accountability, explainability. These four very interesting things are much harder than it seems, right? Um, and people out there say, oh, we just need to build responsible AI, right? And I'm sure you guys know that, it's even hard to define what we mean by responsible AI, right? What do we mean by fairness? How do you measure fairness, right? Transparency, accountability, and again, explainability is kind of a little bit of a myth, right? And we have to be careful. Nothing that it's very highly dimensional, it's going to be explainable 100%. So we're going to lose something. So these guardrails sometimes will be at the cost of less performance, right? So it's still the right thinking to think that maybe a model, a machine learning model or an AI model, right? It's kind of inherently not black box, but at least gray box because it's highly dimensional, and humans aren't that highly dimensional. So this is a very important nuance, very important, right? And more risk management, this is changing. SR 11.7 changed this week, right? So again, this is a very, very, dynamic, right? Very, very dynamic environment. SR 11.7 changed this week. So more risk management is adapting also to the new environment, right? The implementation roadmap, you know, uh, here will design robust robust um, workflows for the finance function, right? And any project that is using AI, because you think that again, there's the judgment of LMM, the quick judgment of LMM will be helpful in, right. Um, will come with we should come with a very strong operational plan, right? Uh, like a clear business case, right? The expected ROI, stakeholder analysis, other requirements, residency considerations, vendor evaluation, and so on and so forth. Okay. So the good thing about AI, right, it's probably for financial professionals, is that in the future, we will be less reliant on okay, I don't maybe need to be a senior Python coder. I certainly need to be a good data scientist in the sense that I need to understand how we can tackle different problems, how we can assess the accounting in different ways, and so on. So ChatGPT, Claude, Copilot, Gemini, DeepSeek, and so on might be things that, right, Power BI, Google Colab, in case we a bit of Python, right, UiPath, and all the Google machinery, so to speak, right. Okay, so we might think that it's lots of things, right? And they are, right? So one of the issues about AI these days is there's like at the beginning too much choice, right? So we will navigate this and give clear, concrete recommendations. Some other courses is like, oh, we're going to show you everything, and you make your choices. Right? We do think that we deliver more value is some sort of say for this it's better to use this or better to use that and so on and so forth instead of spending time trying to learn everything. Right? And let's say each and every of the tool, right? Which is oftentimes a waste of time, right? In the sense that, right, we're going to use one tool or two tools and so on. Why do it's like if we don't tell you Python is a language, maybe then you'll say, oh, I need to learn C++, right? I need to learn COBOL, and so on and so forth. So, right. So, yeah. So again, AI is here. It's not only important; it's inevitable, right? So you're not going to be competitive in the marketplace if you're going to do things timely and potentially less costly if you don't learn to use the technology, but use the technology well, right? So use the LMMs well, use the supervised learning well, and so on and so forth. And that again requires a lot of. So this is why what I wanted to kind of convey, and obviously during the program, right, we can obviously debate and get feedback. Maybe back then we also have in a month or less than a month, we'll have also new tools coming, right, like these Claude Mythos and so on, which is kind of okay. But yeah, so these machines are so good that it's inevitable to use them, right? They're delicate machines. It's like it's a Formula One. You can go very fast. You can kill yourself if you kind of don't if you don't use correctly all the tools, right? And finance is not an easy thing, right? There's lots of risks out there. There are cheaters, there are hackers, there's right. And if we audit, this is what we're going after. And the guys, we're also going to go equipped with smart machines. So uh, even if you want to only defend yourself, right, you also need to try to understand the potential holes that your client might have in their agentic systems, right? Agentic systems are like very delicate. This is like a football team, right? Balances are delicate. It's easy to mess up. Uh, Mistakes can cost us goals, right? And maybe championships and so on. So yeah, and we think that this is everybody needs to go through these trainings. Everybody, right? You cannot expect that professionals in 2026 will kind of use these very powerful tools um, safely, and responsibly and without enough without good training. So
Okay,
that's
thank you, Dr. Alonso, for this perfect summary. I have some questions, please. I will ask you. And of course, for the attendees, they can raise their hands through the Zoom meeting so that the Dr. Alonso can reply to them. First of all, the main question is, what will happen to finance professionals who don't learn AI in the coming years?
well, I think the answer is probably that. For example, it's like whoever didn't want to learn Excel find themselves in the idea, oh, my colleagues are much faster than I am, doing things much And at some point, if you need to, write a report, right? The deadlines will keep adjusting to some sort of AI capabilities. So you won't have 15 days to write a report. You'll have 1 week, or you'll have a couple of days, because we have the numbers. Now we need to write the quarterly report, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, what the practical skills will the participants gain from this course?
The ability to, let's say, the ability to some sort of evaluate and assess what is the AI tool that's going to do a better work for you, right? And yeah, and the ability to build more robust models, right? So there's questions here about AI tools, right? So I mean, the AI tools we everybody is using, not everybody, because the thing is, companies, yeah, of course we're going to choose tools, AI tools. So your company is going to choose, probably if it's a large company, a tool, 5.4 or Claude, right, or Copilot, or to a lesser extent Gemini, right, because it's going to be some sort of a license approved and so on, right? Um, so you need to learn how to properly, how to properly show information, how to properly evaluate, and how to properly spot for hallucinations, right? Uh, just as an example, right, in Wall Street, um, all portfolio managers are using, AI. So all portfolio managers are asking, "What do you think about Apple results?" You have the balance sheet here. Tell me how you see it, right? In depth, right? So their Wall Street is using AIs to some sort of do deep, right? Some sort of financial analysis. So what the guys that were doing M&A, um, obviously are now using AIs to read annual reports, to find inconsistencies, to find opportunities, and so on and so forth, right? So I think everybody in the street, right, is already using Claude and 5.4 and so on and so forth. Also, to ask geopolitical questions, right? Or I think everybody in Wall Street has asked Claude, when the Iran war is going to end, right? Because of the very important implications for all of us, right? So you said we need to figure out, we need a vision, right, so to speak, or a scenario analysis of how could this affect our sales. You see what I mean? And I imagine that not a single soul, right, hasn't tried to do that with Claude or 5.4, right? Here, as I said before, the important thing here is to make machines think deeply and not be too lazy. You see. So again, you can all be using Claude, which is a very powerful machine, still not getting all the juice you can, because you ask very boring and deep questions, right? Like, when is this going to end, right? You should ask much questions that kind of make the machine think much deeper in terms of, right? Um, will this contribute? Yeah. Again, AI will be used in all financial modeling in a matter of months, right? Wall Street is already using it, uh, to do portfolio management, to do all hedge funds, and again, they all had this is also, again, I can have a brilliant portfolio manager that has spent 2 days analyzing, the implications of the war, and you see what I mean, and some other that has done that in 10 minutes because it's too lazy and has done a very superficial, you see what I mean, right? Also AIs are yeah, AIs are also using AIs are also useful for risk management, in the sense that AIs can also help you, can I understand a bit deeper, I don't know, the risk aspects of my businesses? And the answer is probably yes, right? And the answer is you're going to have a much deeper knowledge if you use them, especially again if it's a experienced user that uh, when it's not going to change, right? Is that you need, very powerful users, right? To kind of, the CFO is going to use the LMMs, but the CFO is supposed to have a deep understanding of accounting rules, you know, of the businesses and the risk drivers of the businesses and so on. And she's going to have a kind of a very powerful tool to do that, right? Again, your competition too will have access to these deep. So to a certain extent, you know, it's like if you don't, you're gonna be behind at some point. You're gonna be behind because others are gonna do things faster with a deeper understanding of things. You see, it's like maybe, using ChatGPT is not going to give you a high probability of winning the MBA, right? Uh, but if you don't, you probably are missing, some analytical tools, so you're going to lag behind, you see. So again, in this competitive marketplace, uh, so at some point it's going to be who's using better the AIs. It's like who's using better the players in a sports team, right? Who's making better use of the strikers, who's resting better the players, right? Who's developing them better, and so on, right?
Hello,
Yeah,
sorry for interrupting. I just joined. Sorry for being late. I'm really interested in AI. I'm working in Qatar, and I went to Web Summit. And you know, Web Summit is all including AI and the development and the technology. So mainly, we started applying AI in the company. Wow, this is the trend now. If anyone is not applying AI, as you were saying, we will be behind. So it's about being competitive in a sense that how much you are applying AI in the right way, how much implementations of AI is there in the company. So lately we have applied several things, but still regarding the finance part, it's still a bit costly. So we weren't able to apply it. That's why I joined the session to be able to to know further in deep يعني regarding the finance how we can apply it through our business.
I think sometimes finance is a little bit harder because of what I said before. Is about reading documents is still an open question, right? So you need to read PDFs or PowerPoints, or you need to read very heavy spreadsheets, right? And this is not necessarily easy, right? For AI,
Yes, it's
it's not
there,
easy
but
either for humans, because humans also make a lot of mistakes
exactly.
when processing PDFs or spreadsheets and so on. But there still we have uh,
At
challenges.
Web Summit, I found out several companies are applying AI in finance, but you have to feed the system. So every time you need to feed the system with the data that you want. So as you
Right.
said, if you don't have the knowledge, you will not be capable of applying AI in the company. But the main thing
So
of
you
AI
might
is
say, yeah,
yeah,
you might say that retrieval augmented generation, which is something that you might have heard of, right? It's needed because you need to tell a lot of things to the machine. So you want the machine to read a lot of things it hasn't read. Think about an LMM hasn't read your internal stuff,
exactly.
right?
But in the
And
long
it
term,
needs to.
it will
And
be
this
helpful.
reading
Yeah.
your stuff is kind of cumbersome. So it took us. I recently sold a company called Captite, and we were doing RAG, and we are right, and RAG is the good thing is that you only need to read it well once, right? So you need to work on processing the old documents, but processing them perfectly, right? You see what I mean? So it might take you months to get the AIs reading everything you internal, right? Then you need to check that everything that has been read, the machine has processed it correctly, right? Especially, if you want to, do transactions with, you cannot trust that AIs are going to process payments, right? And not going to do mistakes and so on. You see what I mean? So and their judgment is important, and so on. So yeah, ingesting data is like, I guess, you might say similar things from the application of AI in I sometimes abuse on sports analogies, but think about if you want to use AI in sports, right? Obviously, that's why players need to wear things, because you need to record exactly the movements of the player and so on. And in